Well, you can go ahead and grab your Bibles right now. Turn to Exodus 14 is where we're going to be. Exodus 14 as we continue this series, FLANNELGRAPH God. And for those of you who are wondering what this series title is all about, there are a group of us of a certain age and above in the church, and those of us who grew up in the church who remember back before PowerPoint, back before, they showed videos in these Sunday school classes and stuff. When we were growing up as kids in the church, they used to tell Bible stories on what were called flannel graphs, and they were these big felt-like scenes that they would have, and they'd have movable characters and that sort of thing. And so that's where we get the inspiration for this series. And what we're doing in this series is we're taking a look at some of the most beloved, especially Old Testament stories in the Bible that if you grew up in the church, you grew up knowing and reading and learning about, but I have found they really take on a new dimension when we become adults. And so that's what we're doing in this series. And today we find ourselves in just this incredible story in Exodus chapter 14. But before we turn our attention there, I want to put one of those phrases on the screen that I like to do from time to time. And that phrase is this. It's, if God has led us to it, God will see us through it. If God has led us to it, God will see us through it. Now, I want you to say this phrase with me here this morning, okay? Ready? Go. If God has led us to it, God will see us through it. Very good. Let's say it one more time, really strong voice. Ready? If God has led us to it, God will see us through it. I have a very specific audience in mind for our message today. And that is those of you who find yourself maybe right now in a little bit of a tough spot. Those of you who find yourself maybe between the proverbial rock and a hard place. And what is unique about this tough spot that you find yourself in today is that there is a real sense that this is kind of God's doing. That it is God who has led you to this difficult spot. Maybe there's someone here today, maybe a year ago or so, you were starting to feel a little bit dissatisfied in your job. And so you started praying for God to open up a new opportunity for you. And shortly after praying, just some amazing things began to happen. Doors started to open. A pathway started to appear. And maybe it looked as though God was making it possible for you to start a new job somewhere, or maybe even start your own company, or maybe do something really adventurous, go back to school, something like that. And so you followed this path that God marked out for you. But here you are several months after that, and maybe things have just started to get difficult. Maybe the clients that you thought were going to be there aren't there. Maybe money has become a little bit tight. Maybe your new boss is worse than your old boss. Your new situation is worse than your old situation. And it's kind of hard right now not to feel as though maybe you have been tricked. And you've been saying to God things like, God, I don't understand. I thought this was your leading. Why have things become tough? Did you lead me out here just to have me fail? If that describes you in some way, this message is for you. This message is for those of you who find yourselves right now in some sort of difficult relationship. A difficult relationship maybe you felt God was leading you into, and now you don't know what to do. This message is for those of you who had a horrible year this past year at college, a college that you thought God was bringing you to, and now you're dreading going back again in the fall. This message is for those of you who recently moved your whole world. You moved from one location to another location, again at God's leading, but things have been almost unbearable since. This message is for those of us in this room who have followed open door after open door after open door that God, we believe, has opened for us, only to be led to a place where it feels as though all the doors have been shut, locked, and barricaded. If you find yourself in a place like that, this message is for you. And I hope by the end of this message, you will see the truth that we just proclaimed. That if God has led us to it, God will see us through it. That God would not bring you this far just to have you fail. That God can make a way where there never was a way. If God has led us to it, God will see us through it. That's what I believe this story here in Exodus chapter 14 teaches us. Before we begin in verse 1 of Exodus 14, let me just give you a little bit of background just to catch us up into speed into what is happening right here. Exodus 14 occurs about 1,400 years before Jesus, 1400 BC or so. And for the past 400 years, the Israelites, God's chosen people, the descendants of Abraham, they have been in a foreign country. They have not been in the land of Israel. Instead, they have been in Egypt. And for the vast majority of those 400 years, the Israelites have actually been enslaved in Egypt. One of the pharaohs actually put them to work, enslaved them, oppressed them. And they had to do some really hard manual labor as a result of that. Well, one day earlier in the book of Exodus, we're told that in the midst of their slavery, the Israelites, they cry out to God for deliverance. And God hears their cries, as God always does. And through an extraordinary sequence of events, actually through 10 extraordinary sequence of events, the 10 plagues, God releases the Israelites from captivity in Egypt. God causes the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And then God begins to lead them on a journey that will eventually lead them to the promised land, to Israel, to the land that God promised Abraham that he would give his descendants that we looked at last week. But on the way to the promised land, on the way to Israel, God has the Israelites take a very interesting path. He has the Israelites take a very interesting detour. Pick it up with me in verse 1 of Exodus chapter 14, and you'll see what I mean. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses," and Moses was the leader of the Israelites at this time. "Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart," God says, "and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." And so the Israelites did this. We'll stop right there. Now, obviously a lot going on in that passage with some kind of hard to pronounce place names there. So what exactly is happening here? Well, in order to really understand this passage, we need to do this morning a little bit of a work in geography, okay? Which is why I know you all went to church this weekend to get a geography lesson. But we have to do that in order to understand what's going on here. So we're going to go ahead and put our map on the screen here. And before I go into the details of the map, let me just say this, just for full disclosure. Just so you know, there is a debate today among some scholars as to where some of these places in the book of Exodus are located. We don't know with 100% certainty where some of these places are. And so I say that to say what I'm going to give you is one proposal, I think a likely proposal, for how all of this happened, though not everybody may agree with me, okay? So let's take a look at this map. And to get our bearings here, just so you know, you are looking at the northeastern part of Africa right here, modern-day Africa, into the Middle East. And you see on the left-hand side of the map, that's Egypt. That's where the Israelites have been for the past 400 years. And then on the right-hand side of the map, you see Israel. You see the Promised Land. You see eventually where they're supposed to be heading to. And then at the bottom of the map, you see the Red Sea, the very famous Red Sea. And the Red Sea, just so you know, it begins with kind of a fork-like structure. I kind of think it looks like bunny ears there for some reason. And then it actually eventually combines down to one giant sea towards the bottom of the map. And then it continues on, okay? So that's what we're looking at right now. Now, we learned from Exodus 13 and earlier in Exodus, we learned that when the Israelites are set free from Egypt, they leave an area of Egypt known as Goshen. And we're going to put Goshen on the screen. And we do know where Goshen is. We know where Goshen is, okay? So when the Israelites begin the Exodus out of Egypt, they leave a region known as Goshen. Now I want you to look at that, and I want you to ask you this question here. If Goshen is right there, and if Israel is over there, then what would you think would be the most straightforward, simplest way to travel from Goshen to Israel? What would you think it'd look like? Yeah, something like this. Let's go ahead and put that line on the screen. That would probably be the simplest, most straightforward way to get from Goshen to Israel. And actually, we know from our history books that there was a very well-established trade route at the time of the Exodus that went along that path right there. So that would be the simplest way to go. That's not, however, the way that God took the Israelites. Instead, here's what God did. There are three very important place names in Exodus 13 and 14, and those place names are Etham, we read about that in Exodus 13, and then Migdol and Pi-hahiroth in Exodus 14. And we'll put a possible location of those three cities on the screen. So there you see Etham, Migdol, and Pi-hahiroth. And what we're told in Exodus 13 is that when God has the Israelites leave Goshen, he takes them initially to Etham by way of Migdol and Pi-hahiroth. So he has them take a path that looks like that green line right there, right down along the side of the Red Coast, and then they hit the bottom, and then they go north a little bit to Etham. So rather than take this very straightforward way to the north, God has them take that way. And to our eyes, it doesn't make very much sense, does it? But then God has the Israelites, we learn in the first two verses of Exodus 14, then God has the Israelites do something that makes even less sense. Once the Israelites are in Etham, God then actually has the Israelites turn around. He has them turn back south and head basically the way they go, back down towards Pi-hahiroth, until they settle on that little point there, right on the edge of the Red Sea. So again, rather than have them go this really simple way to the north, what does God have the Israelites do? He has them travel south, then has them travel north, only to have them travel back down south again. It's a very weird sort of route. And what we're told in verses 3 and 4 of Exodus 14 that I read is that the Egyptians, they're watching this and they pick up on this. And because of this weird route that God had the Israelites take, it looks to the Egyptians as though the Israelites have no idea what they're doing. They're just wandering around in the desert. They have no idea how to get to Israel. And we're told that it's exactly at this point that the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, begins to regret his decision to let the Israelites go. Pick it up with me now in verse 5 of Exodus 14. This is what it says. It says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. Verse 8, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. We'll stop there. Now, once again, a lot going on in that passage. And before I sort of summarize what's going on there is one little detail in this passage that I have to talk about, because we've come across it twice now, and I know some of you have questions on it. And that is 2 times in this passage, it talks about how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You see that once in verse 8. We also saw that back in verse 4. It says God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Now, what exactly is going on there? Well, in the Bible, a hardened heart, that phrase, a hardened heart, that is used to refer to a heart that's been closed off to the things of God. That's a phrase that is used to a heart that is turned against the things of God. And among other things, it conveys someone who is arrogant. And it conveys someone who lacks compassion. That's what a hardened heart refers to in the Bible. Now, if you read through the book of Exodus, you will see no less than 20 times it talks about how Pharaoh's heart has been hardened, how Pharaoh has been turned off to the things of God. But here's where it's interesting. The first 5 times or so where it talks about Pharaoh's heart being hardened, the Bible makes it clear that it's actually Pharaoh who has done this to himself. It says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Pharaoh turned himself against the things of God. And then once it says that, and only once it says that, then it begins to say, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, which is what we see in this passage. So what does all that mean? Well, I know some of you may look at this and say, hey, this is not fair, right? God is actually turning Pharaoh against him. That doesn't make sense. But what you need to realize is that all God is doing is he's responding to the choices that Pharaoh has already made in this life. Pharaoh has already turned himself against God. And God is merely giving Pharaoh what he's already asked for. And by the way, that is something sometimes God does in this life. We can close ourselves off enough to the things of God that God can actually get to a place where he says, okay, I'll give you what you want. I'll give you what you asked for. And that's what God is doing to Pharaoh in this particular story. So here we see, right, all of a sudden Pharaoh regrets his decision to let the Israelites go. Just so you know, when the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, they were the workforce of Egypt. The Pharaoh put them to work. They had to do really hard manual labor 7 days a week. And when Pharaoh ended up letting the Israelites go, he lost basically the hardest workers in Egypt. I mean, it is estimated that maybe 2.4 million Israelites left in the Exodus. So he lost his entire workforce. And so you can imagine, right, all of a sudden Pharaoh is looking around Egypt, maybe seeing all these unfinished projects and going, what in the world have I done? Why have I let my hardest workers go? And so when he sees the Israelites do this wandering around in the desert, he figures, hey, they're ripe for the taking. And so he gets together all of his best soldiers, they hop in chariots, and they head down where the Israelites are so that maybe they can capture them again and take them back to Goshen and enslave them again. And so that's what they do, and that's what leads us now to verse 10 of this passage. Look with me at verse 10. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. Let me read that again. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. I want you to get this scene in your mind. As best as you can, I want you to get it in your mind. Because of this weird path that God had the Israelites take, when we get to verse 10 of this passage, the Israelites have basically found themselves in a dead-end street. Okay, they have found themselves between a rock and a hard place. Behind them is the rock. Behind them is the Red Sea. Behind them is this giant body of water. We'll put a picture of the Red Sea on the screen. This is what lies behind the Israelites, this giant body of water here. And obviously, there is no way that the Israelites can travel this way. Now, I know many of us know how the story ends up, but let's just say in the Israelites' perspective, logically speaking, there is no way they can escape this way. There's no way they can travel this way. So this is what is behind them, this huge body of water. But now we're told in front of them is the hard place. In front of them are their old oppressors, the Egyptians. And the Israelites are no match for the Egyptians. Yes, the Israelites are large in number, but they don't know how to fight. In fact, we're told earlier in Exodus, they don't even have any weapons. And the Egyptian army was one of the fiercest armies that the world has ever seen. And now, all of a sudden, they are right in front of the Israelites. And so the Israelites find themselves in this predicament, in this dead-end street. The image that came to my mind this past week is that scene that we've probably all seen in like chase movies before, where the hero, where he finds himself in an alleyway. Let's put that picture on the screen. We've all probably seen images like this, right? Where the hero finds himself in this alleyway, and there's two large buildings on either side, and there's a wall or a fence behind him. And in front of him, all of a sudden, the bad guys are closing in. The only reasonable way out is blocked. And that's where the Israelites find themselves in the middle of this story. And what I want to point out to you, and this is what brings me back to what I said at the beginning, is that it is God who led them to this spot. It is God who brought them to this moment. It is God who led them to this dead-end street. And I think there's something that we need to recognize in that. You know, one of the things that I have found in life is that there are some times where we're going to find ourselves in life in dead-end streets, in difficult situations, because of maybe some poor decisions that we have made. You know, you get behind the wheel of a car when you shouldn't, and you get in an accident. You get caught slacking off at work, and you get fired. You cheat on your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you lose that relationship. And those are tough spots. Those are difficult situations that are caused by our own, poor decisions in this life. And sometimes that happens. But sometimes we can be doing everything right. Sometimes, in fact, we can be doing everything we can to honor God and follow God's leading in our life, and still we find ourselves in dead-end streets. Still we find ourselves in difficult situations. If you were here a month ago or so, I talked about in a message I gave how my brother and sister-in-law recently moved clear across the country to Florida. They moved from Orange County to Florida. And this is obviously a huge life change, right? And so my sister and brother-in-law, I think I said it the other way before, my sister and brother-in-law, they did not make this decision lightly. I mean, they are a family that wants to honor God, and so you better believe they prayed about this decision. And they enlisted the prayers of others. And I think all of our prayers were exactly the same thing. And it's a prayer I'm sure many of you have prayed before. And that prayer is, God, if there is any reason that they should not move, make that clear to them. God, if there is any reason that they shouldn't go to Florida, please, please, please stop them. But God didn't stop them. In fact, it was really amazing the number of doors that God opened that made it really easy for them to move to Florida. Well, now they've been there about a month or so, and guess what? It's gotten a little bit difficult. It's gotten a little bit tough. And indeed, some of the doors that opened that made it easy for them to go to Florida, now that they're there, some of those doors have begun to shut. And this is a really puzzling sort of experience. I think it always is in these circumstances. You know, it's one thing to be in a tough situation caused by your own doing. But it's another thing, right? When you're trying to do everything that God wants you to do, when you're trying to follow God's leading and still things get difficult, still you find yourself in a dead-end street, that is a really confusing sort of season in this life. And it's for that reason I absolutely get the response of the Israelites in verse 11 of this passage. Look with me at verse 11. Here the Israelites are between this rock and this hard place, the body of water, the Red Sea behind them, and their enemies in front of them. And in the midst of this, we're told they cry out this complaint. Verse 11, it says, they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us up out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And here we see just this impassioned complaint of the Israelites. And I know for many of us who maybe grew up in the church and grew up hearing this story, I know that we are conditioned to sort of scoff at the Israelites here and to mock them and to laugh at them, especially this statement, right, where they say, was it because there were no graves in Egypt? Is that why you brought us out here so we could die in the desert? I mean, what a statement, right? But I really think the only reason we're tempted to laugh at the Israelites here is because we know the miracle that lies in front of them. And we know how the story turns out. And we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the Israelites. All they see right now is an absolutely impossible situation. And I think their response is a very natural, and I think it's a very human response. I know I've had a response like that before. You know, God, if I knew that this was how things were going to turn out, I'm not sure that I would have made this decision. If I knew how difficult things were going to get, I think I would have stayed where I was. I think I would have stayed in the other job. I think I would have stayed in my other career. I mean, I can't be the only person in this church who's ever had a conversation with God like that, right? I think this is a very natural, and I think this is a very human response. But that's exactly the problem with it. It's natural. It's human. It leaves out the supernatural. And it leaves out God and what our God is capable of. And that's exactly what Moses wants to remind the Israelites of next. Pick it up in verse 13. After this impassioned complaint by the Israelites, this is what Moses says. It said, Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Now, I think this is one of the most remarkable passages in Exodus, so I'm going to read this again. I want you to mark this somehow in your Bibles. It says, Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And what does Moses do here? He drops the mic, doesn't he? Moses brings God back into the picture, and he reminds the Israelites of what God can do. And if I could paraphrase what it is that Moses says here, I'd paraphrase it with the statement I had to say at the beginning. Israelites, don't you understand? If God has led us to it, God's going to see us through it. God would not lead us this far just to have us fail. God can make a way where there never was a way. And that's why Moses says what he says here in verses 13 and 14. He says, so we don't need to be afraid. He says, we can stand firm. We don't need to budge an inch. In fact, he says, we can be completely still. Why? Because God is going to fight for us. God's going to figure things out. We don't need to be afraid. We don't have to budge an inch. Imagine saying that if an army of evil enemy forces is approaching you. We don't need to budge an inch. In fact, we can be completely still. Why? Because we know that God is going to fight for us. And God's going to figure things out. And I know that some of you in your situation right now, you need to hear exactly that. That you don't need to be afraid. That you don't need to budge an inch. You can stand firm. In fact, you can be still. And if I could offer my own translation for that, I'd translate it this way. You can sleep well tonight. Why? Because God's going to figure things out. God's going to fight for you. When I was a kid, my mom had a sign in her bathroom when I was growing up. And she read it almost every morning, and therefore I read it almost every morning. And the sign said this. It said, good morning, this is God. I will be handling all your problems today. I won't need your help, so have a great day. And I like that. I will be handling all your problems today. I won't need your help, so have a great day. And that's what God is saying to the Israelites here through Moses. And that's exactly what God does. So here the Israelites are, right? This body of water behind them, one of the greatest forces in the history of mankind in front of them. An impossible situation for a human, but not an impossible situation for God. In fact, it's in these situations that God does his best work. And that's exactly what God does here. And in the span of just a few hours, one after another, God performs 3 amazing miracles for the Israelites. The first thing that God does is God shields the Israelites. He shields the Israelites. Pick it up in verse 19 of this passage. It says, then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so that neither went near the other all night long. Now, what's going on here? Well, we're told elsewhere in the book of Exodus that one of the ways that God leads the Israelites during the Exodus is through what is called a pillar of cloud. It's a huge cloud-like structure. We'll put a picture on the screen of what it may have looked like. And this huge cloud-like structure was always in front of the Israelites, leading them every single step of the way. Well, what we're told in this passage is all of a sudden, this cloud-like structure, it begins to move until it settles in between the Egyptians and the Israelites, making it so the Egyptians can't see the Israelites. Now imagine that. All of a sudden seeing this huge cloud-like structure just up and move until it settles between these two groups of people so that the Egyptians can't get to the Israelites. That's the first miracle that God performs. God shields the Israelites. Second miracle, God makes a way for the Israelites. God makes a way for the Israelites. Look with me at verse 21. It says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And so we're told here, right, Moses lifts up his hands, and all of a sudden, this great wind begins to appear, and the sea begins to just split in two until it makes dry land appear over which the Israelites are able to travel. And I'm sure that many of you right now, you have that Charlton Heston scene in your mind from the 10 Commandments. And honestly, that's probably not a bad representation of what it may have looked like. I mean, it's an absolute miracle of nature that God performs there. He makes a way where there never was a way. And for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, a lot of scholars have pointed out that the language of verses 21 and 22 that we just read, it's very similar to the language of Genesis chapter 1 when God creates the world. And what a lot of scholars believe that what God is doing here is he's doing a new act of creation. Just like when he created the world, he's making land appear where there was no land. And so this is the second miracle that God performs. And then the third miracle that God performs is God takes care of the Egyptians. He takes care of their enemies. And you can see this starting in verse 23. And as you read that, you'll see there's a few things that God does. First of all, we're told that God confuses the Egyptians. He messes with their minds somehow so they don't know what they're doing. Second thing that God does, we're told that God locks the wheels of the chariots of the Egyptians. He makes it so they can't move. He makes it so they can't drive. And then the third thing that God does, we're told most famously, is after the Israelites are traveling on the Red Sea, the Egyptians begin to pursue them on the floor of the Red Sea. And as the last Israelite has made his way across and all the Egyptian army is now in the middle of the Red Sea, Moses closes his hand and the waves come back crashing down and all those Egyptians have been killed. All of them drowned. God takes care of the Egyptians. And so one after the other in rapid succession, God just performs these amazing miracles for the Israelite people. He does the impossible. He makes a way where there never was a way. And what I want to let you know today, Friends Church, is that our God is still in the business of doing that. Our God is still in the business of doing that. Let's put that phrase on the screen again. If God has led us to it, God will see us through it. If God has led us to it, God will see us through it. Let me tell you something I've learned in my 17 years or so of really seriously following Jesus. One of the things that I have seen in my 17 years of following Jesus really seriously is that whenever God calls you to do something and you do it, very rarely, if ever, is it going to turn out exactly the way that you expected it to. Very rarely, if ever, is everything going to go smooth. There's always going to be some sort of roadblock. There's always going to be some sort of difficulty. I was thinking this past week. I cannot think of a single time that I felt God's leading in some direction where I have followed it, and there hasn't been some sort of dead-end street. There hasn't been some sort of difficulty. It seems that God has a habit of leading us to dead-end streets and impossible situations. And do you know why that is? It's because God does his best work in dead-end streets. It's because God does his best work in impossible situations. I was meeting with a guy just a couple of weeks ago from our church. And this is a guy who I think about a year and a half ago or so now, he felt as though God was leading him to start his own company. And so he left a very secure position at another company in order to set out on his own. And at first, things were really good, things were really exciting, but then things started to get difficult. And he hit some roadblocks. And he basically got to a point where he needed to have a special loan approved for his business, or he was going to have to close up shop. And for weeks, it looked like this loan wasn't going to get approved. So he and his wife, they prayed about it. God, we felt like you led us to this, and so would you please come through for us in some way? Well, when I met with him a week and a half ago, he had this huge smile on his face. He said, I'm in a good mood today. And I said, why? He said, because 5 minutes ago, I just got the phone call of my life. And what he found out is in just the nick of time, just at the right time, that loan got approved. That loan came through. And as we were sitting there reflecting on that, he said this to me, and I quote here. I actually took out my cell phone and wrote it down because it was so good. He said this. He said, Chris, my back was up against the wall, and God came through. He said, my back was up against the wall, and God came through. And when he said that, you know what I thought to myself? I thought, of course, God came through. Because that's what our God specializes in. That's what our God does. Because it's one of the ways, brothers and sisters, that God gets us to trust in him. It's one of the ways that God gets us to see that he is worthy of our trust. Do you know why? Do you know why these events happened in Exodus 14 the way that they did? You realize, don't you? You realize that none of what happened in Exodus 14 was a surprise to God. I mean, we learned that the reason why God has the Israelites take this weird path is so that the Egyptians will pursue them. This was all in God's plan. This was all in God's design. God deliberately led the Israelites to this difficult situation. You know why that is? We find out one of the reasons, at least at the end of this chapter. Look with me at verse 31 of Exodus 14. It says, and when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, their servant. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared their Lord. And you may want to underline this phrase, and put their trust in him. The reason why God led them to this moment is so that the Israelites would begin to trust God, so that they would begin to see that he is a God who can be counted on. And God does the same thing with us today. You know, if life always turned out the way that we wanted it to, if everything always went smooth, then we never learn to trust God. You're never going to learn to trust God if we always find ourselves in situations where we can always trust ourselves. We're never going to learn to depend upon God if we always find ourselves in situations where we can depend upon ourselves, where we can figure things out ourselves. If we're going to learn to trust God, then regularly in this life, God is going to have to bring us to places where we can't trust ourselves. And our only hope is for God to come through. And our only hope is for God to deliver us. And so God brings us to these places in life to teach us what trust looks like. And that's why I want to leave you today with this. I know some of you right now, you are in a dark spot. And this is, in a sense, God's doing. You felt God was calling you in one direction, you followed him, and now all of a sudden things have begun to fall apart. And I know the temptation in these times. The temptation is doubt. You want to doubt yourself? God, did I really hear from you correctly in that? Or you want to doubt God? God, have you brought me out here just to have me fail? And I know exactly what those seasons are like because I went through one myself. And when I went through one of those seasons several years ago, someone shared with me this quote that brought me incredible comfort. V. Raymond Edmond, the former president of Wheaton College, he once said this. He said, don't question in the dark what God showed you in the light. Don't question in the dark what God showed you in the light. If there is a quote for this story in Exodus 14, it is that quote right there. Just because things have gotten tough, it does not mean that you heard from God incorrectly. And it does not mean that God has brought you out to that place just to have you fail. No, our God does not delight in our failure. But what I want to suggest to you is the moment that you're in right now, it may just be your Red Sea moment. It may just be the moment where God wants to show you and he wants to show the world around you just what he can do, just what he is capable of. God can turn a business around in a matter of days. I've seen him do it. God can bring a new friend into your life this week that makes your current difficult living situation begin to turn around. God can bring a breakthrough in your marriage tonight, in fact. As you leave this place, God can open a door that you didn't even know existed. And not only can God do that, I really believe he will. I've seen him do it over and over and over again. And in some way in your life, I promise you, God is going to show up. It may be in a big way, it may be in a small way, but God is going to show up. Why? Because if God has led us to it, he's going to see us through it. And that's why I remind you of Moses' words in verses 13 and 14. You don't need to be afraid. You don't need to budge an inch. You can sleep well tonight. Why? Because God's going to fight for you. God's going to figure things out. If God has led us to it, God will see us through it. Do you believe that here today? As we close here, this past week I felt a little bit inspired. And at the risk of being overindulgent, and I know I'm very much bordering on that these days, I wrote another little poem, okay? And as we close here today, I'd love to share with you this poem. What does Exodus 14 teach us? I think it teaches us the following. When fear begins to grip you and God's path becomes obscured, remember this unshakable truth found in the pages of God's word. There is nothing impossible for our God. No wonder he cannot tame. Winds obey his every word and seas part at his name. Legions of enemies lose their way. God ruins what they have planned. But he always protects his chosen ones with love and an outstretched hand. So don't let faith give way to fear. Let God supply the fight. And never question in the dark what God made clear in light. Let me read that last stanza again. Thank you. So don't let faith give way to fear. Let God supply the fight. And never question in the dark what God made clear in light. My prayer is this week that each of us would see the truth that is contained in that.